Okay. Welcome everybody to our class. I hope you guys are having yourself a good day. This is the asynchronous class that we're going to have, and hopefully it'll be a better class. There's a lot more things that I can add, a lot more things that we can take off. However, I'm going to make sure that it will be in line with our discussion. And again, you have yourself a video, so you can go over it. You can have closed captioning. You can do a lot of things. So it's going to be a very interesting class and hopefully an enlightening class for everyone. So forecasting is quite a big important item for operations. We always have to understand how we come down to a number, how we come down to ordering an item. This will be very important later on in our discussion. There are so many other obstacles, so many other areas that we look at, and definitely this will be an important aspect because again, we have to ask the question: how much should we order? When should we order? Why should we order? So it plays such an important role for us. So we have to understand where these numbers arrive from. So now let's for today's conversation, we're going to talk a little bit more about a company that does it very well, and that company is Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. Why did I pick it? Because again, they do have a huge history behind themselves. They also they deal a lot with purchasing, with procurement, with numbers, and they have to figure out how many people as a service they have to fulfill. Okay, so that means how they have to operate the park, how they have to proceed on a day-to-day basis, and eventually how they look at forecasting. So we're going to define what forecasting is, talk about the strategic impact of forecasting for operation managers, the steps that I need to do forecasting, not just decide when forecasting should be done, and eventually what kind of approaches are we going to use when it comes down to forecasting? What kind of time series forecasting are we going to look at? How do we going to manage control forecasting at the end of the day? And eventually, how people use forecasting in things like services like school, like restaurants, entertainment, and even Walt Disney. Okay, how do they do that? So now let's, of course, by the time that we're going to finish our conversation, we will understand together the free time horizons, which model together forecasting and how forecasting could be done, and then explain when to use forecasting, how to use forecasting, and what kind of models do we need to use in forecasting approach. Eventually, we're going to apply what we call the naive approach. Naive approach, as it's called, it's very naive. We're going to figure out the naive movement of forecasting, the moving averages, exponential smoothing, eventually the trend methodology, and eventually, hopefully, finish out with different trend methods. However, when we're done our class, we're also going to look at computing the free measures of forecasting accuracy, talking about indexes when it comes to seasonality, because some seasons, for example, the winter season for Christmas, holiday giving, summer season, completely different, but you have to deal with it in different areas. We're going to conduct both regression and correlation analysis and even monitor our tracking signals to make sure that we never always hit the buzzer when it comes down to forecasting. However, we want to figure out where forecasting is going to be done. So now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about who does forecasting best and who does it best. Walt Disney. So Walt Disney, as you guys know and love, they are a big name when it comes to resorts, but also movies, entertainment, streaming, and beyond. They have a global portfolio in the resorts. They have parks right around the world, including Hong Kong and Paris, Tokyo, Orlando, and Anaheim. And their revenues are derived by one important aspect: people. People come and people spend money. Whether they're going to buy a ticket to go to the resort, whether they're going to be in the resort buying tickets for a ride, buying food, buying concessions, doing all sorts of things. So revenues are coming from the people, how many visitors are arriving, how to spend their money, and most of the time in forecasting, operation managers look at it and do a daily management reporting to contain only the forecast and the actual attendance at each park. So the global company profile for this particular company is that there is a lot of people that are visiting them, and Disney has one of the more very intuitive, very challenging forecasting systems in the world. So the company looks not only at historical data, and they have like 50 years of information from weather, from patterns, from sales, and beyond, but also inputs that include vacation schedules of the nearest public schools, exchange rates in the open markets, GDP, economic data, and airline specials that airline agencies give for many of their resorts. So they put in a 1 year forecast, and amazingly, the 1 year forecast comes back to them a year later, and it's very, very accurate. So such accuracy is very, very crucial as forecast drives many different management decisions, including when should we open up in our park hours, the number of charters. To distribute into our resort, the amount of food and purchasing we need to buy, the amount of shows, you name it. Everything goes in line with this resort. So what do they do on a day-to-day basis to make sure their numbers are correct? Very simple, guys. They look at a forecast, and what they use is they go into a daily forecast, a weekly, monthly, annual, and even a 5 year forecast. Okay. So again, daily forecast, they want to see the numbers. So they have numbers throughout the year, and they want to meet it. Okay, so when the park closes by 9 o'clock, they go back, they review it, and then they say, well, we proposed we're going to have 900,000 people go to our parks. We missed target. What happened? Okay, and sometimes it could be, the weather. It could be the economics. It could be COVID-19. Okay, in COVID-19, in 2019, people predicted that by July of 2020, we're going to have a lot of people. Turns out, how many did they have? Zero. Okay, they had nobody because there was a lot of slowdowns. There was a lot of control over who comes in and so forth. And eventually, nobody actually visited their park. Okay, so they look at both weekly, how many people they need to hire, monthly, their budget, annually, their goals, and in 5 year forecast, they have to look at expansion. They have to figure out what rides sell, what rides do not sell, their intakes, their outtakes, pricing, and so forth. So when they put all these forecasts together, they try to figure out the manpower, the human resource, the labor management, how to maintain the park properly. Okay, so they want to have a clean park, a park that has good bathrooms, not bathrooms that are overflowing with the toilet, and hygienic problems. Operation wise, they want to make sure that they can operate and nothing is closed. They have money coming in, money coming out, and eventually a good schedule in the park so that they can meet all their parameters. However, they also look at forecasts they used in opening times. They want to make sure that the rides are going to be in full capacity, their shows are going to be entertaining and in demand. They have to make sure that, we talked about operation levels, that their operation levels is at the max so that they can operate properly, and also figure out how many people are actually coming. Because again, we're talking about human beings, and human beings in the split of a second could make a really, really harsh decision, okay? Whether the family has to cancel, whether somebody gets sick, or whether you have a kid that might have a temper tantrum and they may take the family off course. Anything can happen in the forecast, and forecast will not always be correct, but they can get a pattern. And one of the patterns that Walt Disney has looked at was that they realized that 20% of customers, they do come from outside the United States. Okay, so outside the United States, they do have quite a lot of customers. So that means 1 in 5 of the park goers are not even American, or they're not even from the country. So that means that we have to figure out where they're coming from. We also have to figure out economic models, for example, GDP growth, cross exchange rates. So again, as Canadians, when the Canadian dollar is really strong, it's very attractive to go down south. Okay, and that means you're going to have a huge demand of Canadians. You also have to figure out when people arrive into the United States. They have two locations, one in California, one in Florida. Not everybody's going to go directly to Florida because there's not, international flights all around the world that arrive there. People arrive from New York, from Boston, Chicago, Seattle. They go from everywhere. Okay, so they want to figure out where people come from and how do they get to the main resort. So they have a staff of roughly 35 analysts. These are mathematicians, and along with 70 field people. So they have a department of around 100 people, and they survey roughly about 1 million guests per year. They survey the employees to figure out, how well the employees enjoy their work. Travel for professionals. So they talk to travel agents, ask them, will you be offering, Disney packages along with your trips? And if they say yes, then it means that there is a pattern that we want to look at. Okay, so we look at all these numbers, and what these 100 individuals will do is that they input the forecast model to figure out airlines and figure out when airlines are going to give specials. So that means if the airline will give a special, people will arrive at their locations. They also have to look at the Federal Reserve policy. Okay, if the interest rate is very attractive, money is available in the market. People are printing money left, right, and center. And that means, of course, that because it's printing, you can go and travel on somebody else's dime. Okay. And that means you can buy, a car, you can buy a house, spend money today, worry about it later on. That's the idea of a very low interest rate. If interest rate goes up, you're scared. They tell you to put the money in the bank. You'll get more interest on it. And eventually, if you have a hard time paying things off, it's not very attractive to go to Walt Disney with your family. However, if Wall Street says otherwise, if Wall Street says that, people are making money and there's dividends and growth in your stock portfolio, definitely you want to make the family enjoyable. You also want to look at vacation holiday schedules and figure out exactly when are people off of work, okay? So eventually, they even track when are their schedules for about 3,000 school districts around the world. And the reason is every school district is different, even in the United States. It's very different. When you look at the United States, mostly in northeastern United States, people start um, their you know summer holidays in the end of June and then come back in September. But that's not the same in, say, southern United States, southwest United States, southeast United States. They actually finish school by sometime in May, and then they come back to school in August. So as you can tell, you have some students, a good handful of students, who will start going to your parks by May, and then all of a sudden by June, by like the first week of July, it just ricochets up, and then eventually it will tilt a little bit down, and eventually most of August will be very busy, but then a good chunk of these people will go back to school, and then by September a good majority will leave. But does that mean only in a handful? No. Other schools are still going to be different, and other places are going to also include that. So, what they have going to look for is that the average rate of forecast is that they will accept some form of error, and usually in a 5-year forecast, it's around 5% of error, meaning that they may predict it, but it could be off a little bit by 5%, 5% more, 5% less. When you look at yearly, that goes down to less than 3%. And that means, of course, when they make a good, accurate forecast, whether it's on sales, people, amount of workers, or the rides, they want to nail it. Okay. However, when we look at the definition of forecasting, like forecasting is done at Walt Disney, it's a little bit different. It's a process of predicting a future event, underlying the basis of all business decision going forward. And a lot of times, production, inventory, personnel, and facilities are predicted on it. Okay, so whether you're going to predict, gambling, whether for gambling, deciding how, you know, a thick or a thin coat you want to wear, or you want to wear any shorts, go ahead. I'm wearing a t-shirt, very unorthodox. You never see me in t-shirts at school. Or determining which career would be most interesting and lucrative in the next 5 to 10 years. We all make one form and another based on forecasting decisions on a regular basis. Okay, are you going to pass my class? Okay, you guys have been in my class for like 3 weeks right now. How well are you confident in passing? I would say it would be good, but later on, if you neglect this class, if you move on, the number will not be the same. So all business decisions, the same way as your school decision or your outside decisions, they're ultimately driven by forecast of a future event. However, a poor forecast will likely lead to a poor decision making. And if you have a poor decision making in operation management, even if the decision methodology is sound, for example, like, garbage in, garbage out, Geico in computer programming, you sometimes end up with bad results. Okay. So again, we do forecasting all the time. We forecast how much of a grade we want. We forecast who we want to marry. We forecast when we want to marry. We forecast, for example, our success. We even forecast what we are going to do in the weekend. And if the weekend says it's sunny and nice outside, you will take advantage of it. If the weekend says it's cloudy and ugly, you will do something else. Okay. And there's rewards, there's punishment. And when we look at this in the reality, there's three categories that we forecast in a horizon. And clearly, forecasts from different horizons have different applications. But in most cases, we look at short range forecast. Okay. It can be up to a year during less than 3 months. And things like how we purchase items in our company, how we schedule people for work, the level of people we want to hire. Okay, so if demand goes sky high, there's going to be way, way more people that are going to be working with us, how we're going to assign the jobs, different production levels. All these things are usually up to a year, but in reality, they're about 3 months. So that means 90 days or even less than that. Okay, it could be day to day, week to week, month to month, but nothing more than 3 months. Then, of course, we have medium range forecasts. These are more in production planning of what we're going to produce, how we're going to produce it, and how much money is coming in. We also want to care a little bit more about budgeting. Okay, we want to make sure that our budget levels are going to be healthy. We want to make sure that within these 3 months, we will have the most profit. We also want to make sure that when we deal in sales and production, we want to make sure that we can budget things on time and eventually lead to long range forecasts that could be anywhere beyond 3 months or even 3 years. That means it can be over about 36 months, but you have to be very conservative how long you will do it for. Okay. So when we talk about what's the long range forecast, it's not producing products, it's actually planning for new products, doing research and development, talking about facility, where to pick a new facility, how to develop a new product, how to talk about the long range. So when you adapt these three ideas, short range usually talks about how much sales comes in, comes out daily, how many people come in, how do people get put into a schedule. Medium range talks more about our yearly budget for the park. And then long range talks about, where we're going to expand. Okay. Should we expand within our park? Should we break apart some of the rides that are not popular? Should we put in new rides? Okay. We all talk about that. We all want to make sure that this will be done correctly. And at the end of the day, what we're going to be proposing is that within 3 years, we want to make sure that this occurs. Okay, we want to make sure that this becomes very, very legit. Okay, so again, the only thing I just want to remind you guys about long range forecast is that there's no limit, but you have to become, as a operation manager, very, very conservative about how long you want to do it. If you do it for like 15 years, think about it. We're currently 2024. You're asking me for a 15-year forecast in like 2040. All right. 2040 is way out out of our range, but we still have to talk about it. However, there's a lot of things I would not know about the future, including technology, growth, and beyond. In fact, there's a good story I can tell you about forecasting that includes Canada. In the year 1870, okay, that was about 150 years ago. The Canadian government, that was very new, we only formed in 1867. They sat down in Ottawa and they brought in a mathematician at that time, and they asked him $1 million question, which $1 million is quite a lot of money in the 1870s, but who's counting? They asked him a very simple question. The simple question was, in 100 years from now, 1970, how many Canadians would be living in Canada? And he did the math. He gave statistics. He looked at past statistics, and he gave us a number. And because it was 100 years, he gave something completely out of the blue. He said, and I quote, in 1970, we will have 100 million Canadians. Could you blame him? No. Was he right? No, he was way, way off. Okay, Canada only at that time had like 27, maybe 30 million people at max. Okay, and that was it. And even in 50 years, we only grew by like an extra 10 million people. And we're still like forecast to grow in like the next 10, 20, even 30 years by like an extra 10 million as well. So how do we come up with these numbers? And the reality was, there was numbers that he used in the 1860s, 1850s to see how many Canadians came in, and that number was pretty good. Okay, that number was very healthy. And as we approach the 1870s, 1880s, that number even grew. However, people come, people go, people die, people born. Okay, and he never factored that in. So basically, what he did, he found a percentage, he used that percentage, and he just added, 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 accumulated, and eventually he just said to himself, well, on average, about a good million people come into Canada, and we could expect about a million people every year. So, million, million, 100 years from now, 100 million. Very simple, okay? But that wasn't the answer, okay? The answer was that, in reality, on average, in modern times, Canada takes in roughly about 250,000 Canadians. In Trudeau's time, they took a little bit more. Okay, would that change? We don't know. Okay, that's a forecast that we cannot predict. Later on, we also brought in way more people after World War II, after events in 1990, but also people left. Okay, people left Canada. Okay, so there's a lot of forecast that was missed. And as I mentioned, if you do a 100-year forecast, it's really hard. Think about your own lives, guys. Think about, telling me when you're going to find your first job, when you're going to get married, when you're going to die, when you're going to like own a house. And I did in wrong numbers here, but when is this all going to happen? And you can give me kind of a good estimate, including when you're going to win the lottery, which now has a forecast of like 1 in like 23 million people. It becomes very complex, okay? And what we have to understand here is that we have to understand how we distinguish this time horizon. So when we look at medium long range forecasts, we deal with more comprehensive issues and support management decisions regarding planning and products, plant and process. And even in short term, we look at the forecast that usually employs different methodologies than longer range forecast. But eventually, within short-term forecasts, we tend to be more accurate than longer range forecast. And eventually, the idea here is that when you deal with medium range forecast, we deal with a lot of things with big management. But short term usually talks about the idea how you plan in the long run, but you want to be more accurate in the short term. So again, when I give you 24 hours, you basically know what you're going to do. You're kind of set on it. But when I tell you 24 years, now you have to talk about, decisions, budgets, and beyond, and it becomes a little bit more hectic, okay? What we have to understand is that how do we come to this conclusion? And if we come back to our previous discussion from last week, We understood that there's a product life cycle, PLC, and the product life cycle starts with the embryo stage, introduction. With we get growth, we mature the product, and then we are looking for extending the product. But eventually, we also deal with a little bit of a decline. So introduction and growth requires longer forecast than maturity and decline because again, when you deal with introduction, you don't know what you're going to get. Okay, and as you grow, you might be overwhelmed. Okay, so you want to manage it very, very properly. However, when you mature and then decline, there's already a market out there. Okay, and eventually, as you decline, you know how to cut corners. You know the market very, very well, and you're just dealing in the next few phases as we go. Okay, so the idea behind that is that whenever you're going to be looking at all of these areas altogether, as a product passes through the product life cycle, forecasts are useful in projecting, but then you have to talk about staffing levels. You have to talk a little bit more about inventory, factory capacity if you want to expand it or create another one. And all these conversations will be starting at your introduction, and eventually we'll still be talking about as you go into it. So what do we forecast exactly? We can forecast a lot of things. And as I mentioned, you can forecast your wealth, your career, your marriage, your decline in health. You can forecast, your next move. You can forecast a lot of things. But as a company, we usually forecast a couple of things in hand. No, not your marriage. We couldn't care less about it, but we were definitely interested. But nonetheless, of course, we can always talk about your economic forecast. We can address business cycles. Things like inflation rate does affect us. If inflation goes up, then it will affect how much productivity we're going to have, how much money is there in the market, when do houses start and are developed, and all these economic phenomenons, okay? We can also talk a little bit about technological forecasts, predicting the rate of the progress of technology, how soon would a new product get into the market, and the impact of the technology when we develop a new product altogether. So they become very, very important because we start to understand there is a technological forecast, and some people are ready for a new product, some people aren't, and eventually in forecast, it does help us altogether. Then there's also a demand forecast that predicts sales of existing products and services. We want to make sure that when we predict sales of existing products and services, we want to know exactly what the demand is. So when you take all these three ideas, and many companies, they use the three major types of forecasts to identify, especially in the planning of the future operations. So the operation manager typically focuses on the demand and eventually puts them all together. Okay, so when we look at the strategic side of why we use forecasting and how we apply it, look at what we can do. We can talk about manpower, human resources. When should we hire people? When should we train these people? Again, we don't have Wonderland. Sorry, let me go back. We do have Wonderland. We don't have Walt Disney, but we do have Wonderland. Wonderland is seasonal, and we'll talk about seasonality very soon. But when you're training and hiring these individuals, they're temporary. They're students. They're in college. They're in high school. They may be looking for part-time work in the summer. Whoever they are and whenever they are, you want them to be part of your workforce. Okay. So when you look at the hiring process, you want to start to hire them in January, February, and then by March, train them, and April, get them ready so that by May you can start. So they're knowledgeable, they have experience, they are ready to take on the day-to-day process. And then May, June, July, August, September, they're working. By September, they are going to be laid off, and eventually you're looking for an extension. Okay, so we do that at the same time, and we just don't do that at the wonderful Wonderland. We do that everywhere as well. Okay, you can also do that at other stores. So, for example, by September, when a part-time worker leaves, Wonderland, and they're looking for work, normally a lot of companies, they do hire part-time workers in September, so that when October kicks in, fall is very important for them. But after October, November, December becomes a rush. There's a lot more demand out there for stores. There's a lot of people that will shop for Christmas and holiday gift giving, and eventually the demand will skyrocket. And eventually, when you start to look at where the demand is going, there's also capacity. Okay, you want to make sure that when you have undependable delivery, how you lose customers, how you lose market share, and how you deal with the handful of productivity, space, time that you have. Sometimes capacity is an important item to forecast. You also want to look at supply chain side. Okay, talk about having good, price advantages, good supply relationships. All these things are an important item for you as a company to put in. So demand forecast drives decisions in many areas, including, as you mentioned. But a lot of times, many companies typically do not hire, more workers when demand is falling, or vice versa, when demand is skyrocketing, they don't have enough workers. It doesn't make any sense. So they have to do forecasting. So how do we do forecasting? There's actually a couple of steps that you have to follow. Some of the steps are very simple. Some of the steps are really out there. But the 7 steps in forecasting are on the screen right now. What you see here, especially how you use, say, Walt Disney or Wonderland as an example of each step. A lot of times when you look at a company, they choose one of their own steps to go in, but they could even pick, as you go as a company, or even the capacity of our class, how to describe a company using them and how to implement them. So the first thing you have to do when you look at a step-by-step procedure is figure out and determine the use of forecast. Why are you going to do it? So again, when you want to look at sales, capacity, there's a definition why we have to use it. Then we select the item to be forecasted. We cannot just, go into a park and select food that matches, park goers, that matches, games, that matches rides. We have to look at one specific item, and we determine time horizon to look at it. As I mentioned, you can look at the next 100 years for Walt Disney, but it's very, very hard. So maybe in the next 3 to 6 months is more accurate. You select the forecast model. You gather the data on the forecast model. Make the forecast. Okay, look at the choice of the methodology, and then you're going to validate and implement the results. Meaning, you're going to see if this is correct. You're going to enjoy it, and eventually you will implement it as we go along. Is that it? Do we do it all together? Well, I have to break the ice for my class and tell you guys that when we do forecasting, the reality is not always the same. And why is that? Well, very simple. Okay, when you look at forecasting is never correct. Okay, I told you again, when are you going to win the lottery and win us 70 million buckaroos? And the answer is very, very hard to do. And as a result, could take you maybe 1 week, could take me one lifetime or 2 lifetimes. Okay, so most techniques assume an underlying stability in the system, but it's never correct. You're never going to hit that bullseye. Okay, so we have to understand how we familiarize family of products. We aggregate the forecast demand, and we are wanting to look for a more accurate, plantation of forecasting than individual product forecast altogether. So every company must contend with several realities about forecasting, including those described, of course, in the reality of forecast. But forecasts need to be closely monitored to identify, for example, unusual circumstance or major shifts from historical trends. We also have to understand when decisions can be based on aggregated demand rather than individual product forecast, and the aggregated forecast that should be actually used. So eventually, what we come up with is that we look at forecasting and we look for forecasting approaches. A lot of times when we do forecasting, we can actually look at qualitative forecast. So when companies compare qualitative methodology versus quantitative number methodology, we sometimes have a combination of both, and we would be appropriate, particularly to incorporate a new phenomenon that would not be part of the historical data. So qualitative methodology is used when situation is very, very bleak, very vague, and data either does not exist or very little data exists, but you're not confident around it. So when I, deliver new products, new technologies, a lot of times people forecast based on their intuition, based on what they feel in their heart. Okay? It involves your experience, your intuition, your judgment. So, for example, how do you forecast sales on the internet? You never tried this product before, you like the internet, you know technology, figure out what the number is. So, when we look at qualitative information, we also have quantitative information. Quantitative information is numbers. We like numbers. Numbers tell us a lot of things altogether. This explains examples of figures, percentiles. Okay? So when we have stability and we have historical data, like Wonderland, or even better, Walt Disney, they have like 50 years of data. They can go in and pick existing products and look at current technology, and it involves mathematical techniques. Okay, so for example, if at school you get 50% and you pass, that proves that you have a passing percentile. Not a good one, but it just shows that you passed. Okay, so as long as I have students passing, the number of students passing in my class reaches like a 98 percentile, meaning that out of 100 students every semester, two of them fail, but a good chunk, they are passers. But the question is, a 50% is not a good pass, still a pass, but doesn't tell us a lot more. And when we do quantitative analysis, we want to figure out, well, what is the number, what is the figure, and how do we derive by it? So forecasting, for example, sales of color television is very simple to do. Okay? When you look at TVs, okay, the numbers are very simple. You take numbers from Best Buy, Amazon, Future Shop, TV 2000, all these TV, brand companies that sell TVs, and you look at the market and you realize that, not anyone but everyone, including, civilian, industrial TVs, we all use color TVs these days. So the only opposite of color TV is a gray and white TV or a black and white TV, okay? Or a non-color TV. Does it exist in the market? Yes, no, maybe. It's only nostalgic, but I would say every year since I would say probably 1985 or 86, we all around the world created color TV, okay? So that means that as you go from like 1985 below, there's a good number of people that actually still bought non-color TVs. But for the last 35, 40 years, everyone almost bought color TVs. Okay, so as of 2024, the number that we can predict on color TVs right now as a class, 100%. How do they get that number? Very simple. Okay, nobody buys black and white TVs for industrial, for security, for military, for civilians. We all buy Sony, Toshiba, Philips. We all buy color TVs. So when we look at quantitative data, there are things with rulers, cylinders, thermometers, anything measured. Anything we have numbers, we take numbers and we use it. But numbers can also be deceitful, okay? Qualitative data is your senses, your observation, and your results. It's not just a yes or no binary. It can also be a maybe, a how. Tell me more about it, okay? So that opens us up to more information. So as we saw with qualitative data, a lot of times we use what we call the jury of executive opinion. Executive opinion, we pull people's opinions together from high levels of expertise, sometimes augmented by statistical models, and eventually based on what they feel, and we ask 100 individuals, they give us their own opinion, but it's very positive. And because it's very positive, we want to make sure that we can protect ourselves. Then we have the Delphi methodology, and inside the Delphi methodology, we have a panel of expertise. We query our own questions, and eventually, we have people who know a little bit about it. Okay. Another primary qualitative forecasting methodology is to look at sales forces composite. Okay, this estimates individual salespeople and are reviewed with reasonableness, but eventually, many salespeople, they're very optimistic. And normally, when you bring in a new salesperson and you ask them how much sales are you going to put in the next, 5 months, in the first few months together, they're very optimistic, even though they might not have sales or very poor sales, and they may have doubled, tripled, even quadrupled that number. So it doesn't mean that they're incorrect. It just means that they may be a little bit overly optimistic than what we have accomplished. Then, of course, we can even ask our customers. Okay, so consumers market surveys can also mean that it could also be that same way. So whenever you look at the overview of both qualitative and quantitative approach, in quantitative approach, we identify the forecast methodology to describe especially on numbers, especially when we have mathematical calculations, it should be referred to in a time series or associative models. So things like the naive approach, moving averages, where we have, the last few months, and we want to figure out what's going to happen month 4. We can do moving or exponential smoothing. They're all time series models. And eventually, if you have trends, you can also do time series. But then when you look at linear regression, it's associative. Okay, so if one thing happens, something else will occur. So when we talk about the economy, this becomes very, very unique because again, if we don't have a lot of money in the economy, it can affect travel. It can affect purchase. It can affect housing starts. It could affect the overnight lending rate. It can affect a lot of things. Okay? When no money is in the economy, that means something else will happen. And that means that people who bought, let's say, economic or high end items, they're going to start buying budgeted items. Okay? To protect themselves against inflation or other things. Okay? Same thing when we talk about gas prices. Gas prices go up, it will mean that if people want to travel more than 300 kilometers, it will affect them. Okay? If people take their car every day to work, they're going to decide leave the car at home and I will take the bus at the end of the day. Something like that. Okay? But then when you look at time series components, when you look at the time series models, and we talked about 4 of them right here, the only way you can have the time series models is looking at things like the trends, okay, and setting evenly spaced numerical data obtained by observing responses, observing regular time periods, and eventually forecast based only on past values, no other variable that's important. We also have to assume that the factors influencing past and present will continue to influence the future. So the 4 areas of time forecasting models are the trends. So trends can go up, trends can go down, but we have to figure out where we're going. And sometimes we cannot always hit the spot. Then we have cyclical. It will happen. We don't know when it will happen, but in cyclical, in a cycle, it will happen. We just have to figure out how. Like, for example, recessions, economic booms and busts. Cyclical, we will know it will happen. We just don't know when. But we do know it will happen because we have statistics around it. Then seasonality, we know that if you deal with a product that's in season, there are some seasons that your product will be in high demand, some seasons in low demand. And because of that, you have to adapt how your demand will be. And eventually, you also have randomness. It will happen. It will happen once in a blue moon, but we don't know when and how or if. And a good example of once in a blue moon, COVID-19. Why is COVID-19 a good example of once in a lifetime? Because I would probably bet on it that this was the only experience you'll probably see of a worldwide pandemic. Okay? The last worldwide pandemic we had was in 1916, 1919, the Great Spanish Flu. Okay, it was a pandemic. Lots of people died. However, when you compare the Spanish flu to COVID 19, it's a once in a lifetime event. Okay, I would say there's very handful, very little individuals living right now who experience both the Spanish flu, probably as a infant or child, and also experience COVID 19. It's random. It will happen once in a blue moon, and most likely, most of us will not experience the next great pandemic. We would just not. It will most likely happen sometime in the 2100s. When it will happen, I don't know. Okay, but there's a good chance that you, me, I, and everyone around us might not experience it. Okay? So to give you another forecast that's still down in our line, how about we forecast our break? We could, okay? Because normally I take an hour in, hour out. However, we are also on a video. This is a asynchronous video. And of course, you can take a break right now. You can stop it and take a break for like 5 to 6, 10 hours or 10 days, or you can just wait and eventually it will pop up again. So let's take a break and eventually we'll be back in less than a jiffy. Enjoy, and I'll see you very soon. Bye for now. Or stay around. Okay, and we're back. Thank you guys so much for sticking around and hope you enjoy the second half. So, when we talked about the four stages of forecast, time series components, one of the things that we have to illustrate here is how trend, seasonality, random variations as compared to the average demand over, say, 4 to 5 years looks like. Okay, so to give you a better example of it, what I can show you here from these four areas is, for example, if you look for a seasonal peak, as we saw with Walt Disney, at one point or another, there will be the perfect storm. The perfect storm means that, as I mentioned, people finish school in May, people finish school in June. So by July the 1st, coupled with the fact that in Canada we have the July long weekend, in the United States July 4th long weekend, they're very small in the time frame. The early first part of July will definitely be the peak of seasonality, and then slowly and surely it will go down. Same thing you can do with December. In December, it will be very busy for holiday seasons, and eventually it will die out in the new year. Then, of course, we have what we call random variation. It's a one-off, never been done before, possibly will not repeat itself tomorrow or the next day. It's a very odd situation, and eventually we have to deal with it. And eventually, as we see here, there are trends. So there's a line here right in the middle. That is a trend. And as you can see, regardless of what we are looking at, the trend, which is part of the most important part of understanding, demand, trend says that regardless of season or random variations or whatever we have, we will always go up. Okay, so again, the question now is how do we treat cyclical and what do we do with it? So to break apart these four major areas, one of the things I do want you guys to remember, there is trends, okay? Trends either goes up or down, okay? It's persistent, it's overall has an upward, downward part. In this particular trend, the trend is going down. Doesn't mean we're losing business. It means that we're not having the same exact forecast as we used to. Okay, so a good example of a trend going down. Take, for example, cigarettes and smoking in cigarettes. Yes, there will be a peak. People might smoke a little bit more given the season, given different factors, but on an overall trend, the amount of people smoking cigarettes as compared to 20 years ago has gone down. Okay, so we know that it will go down. But what is another trend that goes up? Things like population, how we adapt to new technology, people's ages, they go up, and so does their trend, and different culture aspects. Normally, the way we see trends is that we don't see trends on a day-to-day basis. We normally see it by years, okay? And sometimes, again, like I mentioned to you, I wanted to compare the forecast on say 2024 smoking habits versus smoking habits in 2004. Completely different, but yet the trend is that it's going down. There's trends that always go up, okay? For example, the Canadian population. I mentioned to you in the beginning of class, somebody in the House of Commons brought in a professor that actually deals with forecast, the future, actuarism. He said, and I quote, Canada will have 100 million people 100 years from now. Was he dead wrong? Absolutely. But was he in the trend? Was he correct? Normally, he was. He was correct, okay? And there was not probably not 1 year within that framework that the Canadian population in the trend did not go up. Doesn't mean it went up, 15% up. Doesn't mean it went up 150%. It went in both sides. But in most cases, the trend is that we talked about the next 100 years. Then, of course, beyond that, we also deal with seasonal components. These are regular patterns that always go up and down, irregardless. It doesn't mean that it's always going to go up the same way, but it will go up. Okay. A lot of times when we talk about seasonality, if good weather, if customs and special events happen, it does occur within a single year, and we know it always happens. Okay, so for example, if you are dealing with tourism, you know that every July long weekend. Okay, July 1st, August, the upcoming August civic holiday, Labor Day. It's the weather, it's really good. It's a long weekend. People take advantage of it. Okay. And the same thing will happen in October when there's a long weekend. November, not really a long weekend, but eventually there's things that we look at in seasonal components that happen every so often. Okay, so again, when I was working at my time at the LCBO, LCBO deals a lot with seasonality. How do we start the year? Well, we start the year very mundane. Not many people drink alcohol in January. Then February kicks in, and there's holidays in February. For one thing, there is the Family Day long weekend. But on top of that, there's also the Valentine's Day. What do you give in Valentine's Day? You give roses, but you can also give wine, red roses. You follow me for more love tips. But irregardless, there's a demand going on in February, and then in March, there's also holidays as well. There's the March break. That's where lots of kids have time off, and eventually, so do the parents. Then, of course, you have April, which becomes very busy because there's the long weekend, Easter long weekends, and so forth. And then you follow it up with May. May opens you up to what we call the May 24. May 24 is the opening of summer. What do people do in summer? People relax. People bring over friends. They have barbecues. They have outdoor patio, and they have liquor. Okay, so the demand of liquor does go up. Uh, in May, then June, there's what we call convocation. People are done school, they celebrate, have a drink. July, same kind of story. People have time off. So does August. And then September comes in, and demand is still strong because it's still summer-ish weather. Okay, but eventually summer weather dies out and students go back to school. When students go back to school, they celebrate. Yes, they do a quick celebration called Frosh Week. Frosh Week is very important for us. And then we follow in October. October is there's only one holiday, Thanksgiving. People have dinner. What do you have dinner with? Alcohol. You have dinner with wine and beer, and the demand still goes up. And then eventually in November, it dies out a little bit, but in the first 2 weeks of November, it's very slow, but then it kicks up again at the LCBO in middle of November because you start to have what we call seasonal holidays. Okay, no, not many people like to have a seasonal office holiday party. Um, Normally they do it like at the last day before the holiday breaks. That's really bad. But normally they do it in December, but sometimes December becomes very busy. And as a result, what occurs a lot of times is that they push it to another holiday, okay? So a lot of times when you look at, the patterns, when you look at weather patterns, they do become very important. And in the second week of November, all the way to most of December, it just becomes crazy. And as a result, at the LCBO, we have to make sure that there is a demand out there. And in the same time, there's also going to be a lot of people that will be working with us. Okay, so I mentioned to you when people are done at Wonderland in September, then they have a couple of weeks off, they apply elsewhere, and eventually the LCBO does have short-term, full-time positions for many of them. Okay, and eventually they go in and work at the LCBO. They work there from September when there's a demand still kicking, and eventually that demand peaks in the wintertime, especially in Christmas. There's holiday parties. People have time off. They enjoy some alcohol. Then New Year's comes in. New Year's, they ring in the new year with champagne and liquor. And eventually, January 1st comes in. We're closed, and then most of January becomes very dry. There's even holidays to mark dry February, dry January, to make sure that people are thinking about their health, trying to cut back a little bit, and eventually start the new year on a good note. Okay. But regardless, that is seasonal components. What is not seasonal is cyclical. Okay, it's a movement that always happens, and it will go up and down. It does affect the economy, does affect the business. There's a lot of political entities that are involved, and different economic factors that make cyclical forecasts happen. The only problem with cyclical is that you can never predict when it will happen. Okay, so as we mentioned, we can forecast a lot of things and we can nail the date, but in cyclical, it's hard to nail it. Usually, in a cyclical, it could be, for example, we're in a boom, and the boom can last for 2 months. The boom can last for 2 years. We don't know, and we don't know when it will happen. Okay, that's the most important part. So when there's a boom, there's also a bust, and when we have bust, it means that we collapse and the economy goes down. But nobody in their righteous mind will tell you that on November the 15th at 2:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time sharp, the economy will collapse. Nobody will tell you that, okay? The economy can collapse in November, as it can collapse in August, it can collapse in April, as it could collapse in January, okay? And any date in between. The only thing is that it will happen, we just don't know when. Okay? So for every boom in the economy, there's a bust. For every bust in the economy, there's a boom. There's an opportunity. It takes time, but the thing is, we don't know how long it will take. We don't know when it will take, and at what point it will take. Okay, and like we mentioned, there is a political cycle around it. So every 4 years in Canada, we go into the politics. You don't like the provincial politician, you can have a new person come in. You don't like the federal prime minister, you can have a new person come in. But whoever comes in, they'll come in, even though Canada is very stable, both provincially and federally. What we will see is that because they will make a certain rule, then there will be a casual and associative relationship around it. Okay, so what occurs a lot of times is because of the cyclical factor, we deal with uneasy situations, and eventually we deal with a lot of different ups and downs. And again, when a new politician comes in, they may increase the tax, and as a result, not a lot of people have money. So that means that businesses will be affected, the economy will be affected by single choices that a politician could and might make. Okay? Then, of course, we come back to the random variation. Random variation is erratic, unsystemic, uncontrolled, on everything, and has residual fluctuation. This particular item is a random component, and because it's due to random variation, unforeseen circumstances, it's short, it's not repeating, and most likely will not happen again. So I'll give you two fronts here. One front, for example, it's Saturday. It's the middle of summer. You work in a restaurant. It's almost about 6 o'clock. It's hot outside. Patio season. Everything's looking good. You have zero customers. Why is that? And the only thing that could happen that's very random is in many parts there might be a ongoing police investigation. Let's say there was a random shooting near your area. They closed off the street. Nobody can come in. Nobody can come out. They're doing their investigation, and it happened at 5:22 p.m. Okay, so as you're entering dinner time, something happened near your restaurant, and it affected it. Would this happen tomorrow, Sunday? Given the fact that it's the same weather, given the fact it's the same weather pattern, and the same shooters, I doubt it. Okay, it's not like the shooters are going to come up to themselves and say, "Hey, listen, I really missed you. I just hit the wall or something. Listen, I'll tell you what. At 5:22 p.m. on Sunday, come back here and we'll see who's alive, who's dead, and we'll just duke it out again." I really doubt this will happen. Only cartoons. But this is a random variation. A random component will never happen again, and in most cases, not in the same circumstance. Same thing could happen, for example, as you can see here in the graph. As you see Wednesday, for whatever given reason, demand was very similar almost to the demand you see on the weekends. Why did that happen? Let's say you are a restaurant, McDonald's, and randomly in the middle of lunch, you are at 80% capacity. And then all of a sudden, two random buses full of kids run into your McDonald's. And all of a sudden, instead of having 80 customers per hour, now you have to deal with something in the range of like 160 customers. So 80 customers in, another 80 on the go. Okay, so randomly it happened, and the way you can explain it is that in a random occasion, all of a sudden, two full buses of like 40 students each, 80 students plus their chaperones came in, and we had to deal with it. Will the same bus at the same time, at the same circumstance, do it again? I highly doubt it. And as you can see here, it did not happen on Thursday nor Friday. Okay, so these are random one-offs. So eventually, when you look at these random one-offs, we deal also with the naive approach. Under naive is very simple, that it could be considered to be qualitative forecasting method. Numerous forecasting is in the real world are made this way because again, it comes from being naive, especially for infrequent events. Okay, so for example, if you have no additional information or data available, you're going to be very naive if people ask you what's going to happen in the future. So it would be a little bit, it would make sense to forecast attendance at this year's, say, Yorkville parade or Yorkville dance to be the same as last year. Why? We never did it a year out beforehand, and this was our first year. So if I tell you we had about 1,000 students, most likely I would tell you today we're probably going to have roughly about 100 students as well. Okay. Why did I get that number? Very simple. Okay. I did the naive approach. And under naive, I did the most naive way to come down to a single random factor. Then, of course, when you assume in the next period it's going to be the same as the demand at the same period, a lot of times salespeople do the same thing. So, since you started in the work, let's say in the first year, in the first month, you were in January and you had only 68 sales. February, you don't know what's going to happen. You're going to assume you're going to have 68. Would that be correct? I'd say it's very, very naive. Very, very naive. And the reason why I think this is very naive is that in February, you have less days. Plus, you're in the middle of the winter. So there's going to be a lot of factors that might say, I don't really think you will have 68. You're lucky, but if you do, it could help. It can help you down the line. And the reason why we like a naive approach, even though it's not always correct, it's very cost effective, very efficient, and can be a good starting point to figure out more information later on. Then the other option you have is something called the moving average. Moving average is a series of arithmetic means. It's used when you have very small, very little trends, but you have something. And it's often used to smooth out different ideas because it gives you an impression of the information over time. So under moving averages, when you look at the demand in previous amount of periods, over that period, you start to get a good number, okay? So a lot of times when you get information about, say, the moving average, it's a simple average that you can forecast, and it is applicable if we could assume that the market demand will stay fairly steady over time, and it can help smooth out random fluctuation. Okay, so when you look at naive moving averages, smoothing, and trend methods, the idea of understanding a little bit about it is that let's assume you're doing sales. You have information of January, February, and March. You take all three of them, divided, add them all together, divide by 3, and then you get the weighted moving average and the moving average. And as you can see, starting in April, you're very conservative, but as you go in, you start to understand that there is a pattern. Okay? And at one point or another, you actually nailed it. You nailed it in September, where the actual sales and the weighted moving average sales was very, very similar. But then what happened after September, where you ran around the office telling people you finally hit the buzzer? Now you went over the number. So as you can see, October you were well off as of November and December. But what you can see here that's very, very important is that in forecasting, you could be dead wrong and still have a pattern. We're after that pattern. And as you can see in this pattern, is that the same kind of hump where in August it peaks and then it goes down in sales. You had the same thing. And that's what we're interested about. But what we're looking for is how did we end up in October where we saw our peak and demand went down? How can we figure out in the next future that this might not happen? And the way you can help yourself out is do something called the mean absolute deviation. Under mean absolute deviation, you have a certain threshold, you put it all together, and a lot of times what they do is they add all the averages of the years together. And as you can see here, there's a difference between 180 and 175. You minus it, you get 5. And the same thing, 168 minus 175, 0.5, 7.5, and you add them together. And then you get a full number of 82. You do the exact same thing on the other side, actual versus forecast, and then you get those numbers. And then between here, you have the sum of the absolute deviation when you do the calculation as something in the range between 10.31 to 12.33. Okay. Now, how do we use this all together? Well, when you actually use what we call mean square errors, okay, you can actually square it and then get the final. Okay, so let's look at these same numbers, actual tonnage. You take the numbers and you look at the forecast. And under the forecast, what you can see here is that on the forecast and on the actual tonnage, you have the discrepancy. But as you can see here, when you are going to do it to the power 2, what's going to happen is that you square it, and eventually you get a whole new number. So when you sum the whole thing up, you get something in a raw data of 1,200 and 1,526.46, but you have 8 different quarters, 8 different years. You divide those 8 years together, and then what's going to happen is you get a number of 190.8. And what we're trying to say here is that the next quarter, you're going to have 191. Okay? So what's going to happen here is that when you look at these numbers, the lowest you have is 159, which is the third week, the third quarter. And the highest you have here is 205. So between 159 and 205, with the average, roughly is around 180, because I see a couple of 180s. What you're going to see is that the forecast for the quarter 9 will be 191. And the way we got it is we did the sum errors, we summed it all together, we divided it by all the quarters we have, and eventually quarter number 9 will give us it. Okay? So using something like this in squares, the least square method implies that we have met some requirements. What we like about this is that number 1, we always plot in a way, um, information and data to assure a linear relationship, and we do not predict time periods far beyond the database. So a lot of times deviation around the least squared line are assumed to be random, okay? And a lot of times when you look at seasonal variation in data, seasonal demand in common in many different industries are associated in a forecast and adjusted based on the account of seasonal variations. So when we try to identify what we call multiplicative seasonal models, a lot of times it's not very obvious in the beginning, but could be classified later on. Because the idea here is that under seasonal variation in data, we have multiplicative seasonal models that we can adjust based on trend. So what we're doing here is we're taking our numbers and eventually trying to figure out the future forecast based on seasonal forecast calculation. But the idea behind that is that when we identify the steps in multiplicative seasonal models, the steps are not so obvious at first, but a lot of times when we try to impact it, it allows us to give us more of a process. And the process that we look in seasonal forecast is number one, we find an average historical demand in each season. So, for example, when we use something like Wonderland, we figure out that on average in the last 50 years at Wonderland, we had about 13 days of rain. Doesn't mean we're always going to have 13 days of rain. Some years actually hit 13 days of rain, but on average, we are going to have 13. It might be more, 20, might be less, 4, okay? But we compute the average demand over all seasons. We compute the seasonal index, 13, estimate next year's total demand based upon it, and then divide those estimates on the total demand by the number of seasons, then multiply it by the seasonal index for that season. Okay, so eventually what we're able to do here is that we're looking at associative forecast. And associative forecast says if you have continual hot days, by using associative forecast, we can have a base on forecasting the patterns, as opposed to basing forecasts on patterns on historical data. Associative forecasting estimates the impact of certain predictors, what we call independent variables. They have an outcome based on dependent variables, and predictors could include things like GDP and the impact that's associated with the economy, the level of advertising. If you have a lot of advertising investments, the return you have on a certain amount of products, the weather for outdoor events, the hotter it is, the better, and simpler linear regression that assumes one independent variable and the other variable is the exact same technique that's used for time series trends. So what happens here is that one thing will impact us on another thing. So a lot of times when we add them all together, the goal is that we look at a standard error of estimate, and that will measure the variability around regression lines and the standard variation. Okay, so what we're seeing here, guys, is that on average, when we look at a standard error of estimates, a forecast is just a point of estimate for a future value. This point is actually the mean of probability. And what we're doing here is that we're looking at success in the economy based on the success of our company. So as you can see here, I got, for example, the amount of years. Okay, let's say 6 years in the future. And based on my current projection, I say that our trend is going up, but I believe based on the economy and the forecast of the economy, the first and second year will be below average. The third year will be good. Fourth year will still go up, but it will mean that we are below the trend expectations. And then eventually, when we meet year 6, and based on the trend, based on the forecast and the other regressions, I believe that by year 6, our company will make $3.25 million, and eventually the line will assume where we would be in the future. Okay, so it means that one thing might impact another, and eventually this is a good idea to start looking at. Then, of course, we have another important item called monitoring and controlling forecast. So regardless, as I mentioned in forecast is the only game in town for operation managers. You could be dead wrong because again, Dead wrong means you're dead wrong in sales, dead wrong in serving it, dead wrong in a lot of things. But the goal of being dead wrong is learning from it. Okay? Sure, you can tell me that tomorrow is going to be sunny or rainy. You can tell me that you're going to pass my class even though you're going to fail it. You can tell me you're going to be a millionaire in the next 5 years. You can tell me a lot of things, and I will listen to it. But the question now is how you track it, how you monitor it, and eventually how you allow for different perspectives to be. So as I told you in the weather, 13 days of the um, uh, the rain for Wonderland is probably sufficient. If it's over and continually over, that means it will impact our sales, our intake of input for buy for merchandise, how many people are going to come to our location of traffic, and then some. So when we track the signals, especially for forecasters, we measure how well the forecast is going to be predicted and the actual values. So when we introduce a notion of tracking a signal, and signals are everywhere. We have dashboards and different signals all around. It makes it a good way to make sure that the forecasting system is doing a good job. Okay, so a lot of times when we illustrate a concept, if the tracking signal falls outside the predetermined upper and lower control classes, forecast method should be examined for possible adjustments. So again, if for the next 5, 6, 7 years, Wonderland is going to get more rain than needed, okay? More rain, then we have to adjust this, okay? Our goal is to make sure that we could hopefully, jump in and eventually make some changes around it, okay? That's the most important part, okay? So the idea of a tracking signal is that we look at a forecast error to the absolute mean deviation, and when we track a good signal, we make sure we can adapt to it. So if forecasting is continually high or low, the forecast has what we call a biased error. Okay, and a lot of times when you look at a biased error, okay, we try to illustrate the concept, and if the tracking signal falls outside of the predetermined upper and lower class, the forecasting method should be examined for possible adjustments. Okay, so when you start to look for example, at what the acceptable range is, the goal is you want to hit zero. If zero means it's perfect. You actually hit it, it was good. But as you can see here, let's say we are selling, let's say, a seasonal item, and for whatever given reason, there's a huge demand, but eventually demand will fall down. Okay, and when it does fall down, we see that's below average, and then it hits above average, below average again, and then at one point at the end, it goes beyond our control limit. Okay, so as you can see here, there's been situations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times where we actually hit the buzzer, but we also had times where we were continually below average, then we were above average, below average again, above, above, and above, below, and then we went through the roof. Okay, so now the question is, how do we make sure that I don't really care about going below the average, but we want to be able to not go over the acceptable range? And that's the most important part. Because again, there might be situations where you actually know that we're going down for a reason and there's no demand, but let it go down for a reason, because if we say have to go out of stock, it's not the end of the world. But if we go out of stock in the middle of the summer, it could really hurt our bottom line. Okay, so these are things where when we start discussing it are very, very important for our components to actually be done at the same time. There's also the other side where in a lot of things that you forecast, you continually forecast items, especially items that are manufactured. Okay, when you manufacture an item, you have days, even weeks upon weeks to adjust it. But in service, it's really hard to adjust. So when we talk about service, which again, come back to week number one, 3/4 of the Canadian economy is service. You have to play a whole new ball game. So forecasting presents an unusual challenge because again, forecasting means, especially for a class, Our class is only 3 hours, and there's special need for short-term records. So again, I have to use previous records that might not be the best, but we need to understand that it greatly serves as a function because different industries, different products have different meanings. Coupled with the fact, and again, I'm using Wonderland, that there's holidays and special events on calendar, you can actually imagine that the amount of demand will skyrocket. Okay, so there will be a lot of unusual events, and eventually, when you have, for example, a long weekend, coupled by amazing weather, coupled by opportunity, coupled by a good growth in the economy, you're gonna see lineups in Wonderland like you'll never see it before. Okay, demand is skyrocket. They have to be at 100% or even more capacity to make sure that they could meet the demand. They have to meet the market, and in order to meet the market, they have to make sure that all these important factors will go in. Okay, they will go in. It will be inputted, and eventually it will be routed properly. Okay, so again, to give you an example of how service is very important, take a look, for example, in fast food. Okay, as you can see in fast food, we know exactly what the demand is, and especially when we identify unusual challenges faced in fast food, because fast food is service. When attempting to forecast fast food, we know exactly it's on time. Okay, so eventually, fast food restaurants, they normally deal with lunch and dinner, so demand is very, very low in usually 8 o'clock to about 10:30, but by 11 o'clock, lunch kicks in. People rely on lunch, but again, we have to decide, are you going to go to my fast food restaurant? Are you going to go to somebody else's? Do you have lunch prepared? Do you not have lunch prepared? These are random factors that we have to put into our service. And then eventually, by 12 o'clock, that's when demand will spike and will keep on spiking from 1 to 2, even 2 to 3 o'clock. Because normally, when you work in an office, not everybody can leave at the same time. So you have like 10 people leaving at 11 o'clock, 10 people at 12, 10 people at 1, and then another 10 people at 2 o'clock. So demand will change. By 3 o'clock, nobody is going to go to a restaurant, and eventually it will be very, very weak by 4 or 5 o'clock, and then 5 o'clock kicks in, and then demand skyrockets again, not to the same levels, to kind of like 1 o'clock, 11 o'clock levels, and then slowly but surely it will die out. Okay, so basically, a run for about 12 hours means there is a demand. We know there's a demand, but the question is, how do we employ people? When do we hire them? How do we make shifts? How do we make demand? What happens if we need to go 160%? All these factors have to be presented. Same thing also when you do service in call centers. Call centers are 24 hours, okay? And this is particularly important for FedEx. And just before we started our class, I did some math and try to figure out how in the world does FedEx actually run. And I have some news for you. Are you here for this? I'll give you the news in. All right. So here it is. Okay. So as you can see here, this is a FedEx call center. It's in Canada. Okay. Now the thing with Canada, when you do your research, Canada has multiple time zones. So these people are working either in office or hybrid, and they're currently working for the FedEx call center. And what they're doing is that they're working in a way where they can complement their demand. As you can see here, demand will peak by 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. The reason is it's almost the end of many of our day's position. They call in, they look at their issues, and eventually they have to deal with it. So eventually, what is occurring here is that between the hours of 8 o'clock, things start keeping up. So in order to meet this demand, we start at 7 o'clock in the morning. We're going to hire 20 people, and these 20 people are going to work from 7 o'clock in the morning, their time zone, roughly around 3 o'clock. Okay? So what happens here is that in that time zone, you're going you're going to have these individual working, but at the same time, just in an hour away, as the demand will spike, you're going to bring in another 40 people, and these 40 people will start work from 8 to 4, but that doesn't stop there. Okay, now that you have 60 people on call, you're going to have 100 people working from 9 to 5, and they will work the average shift. And eventually, you're going to also have people working from 11 to 7. That will be 50 people to meet the demand at the spike. So, what we're saying here is that by the time we reach peak levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 o'clock, you're going to have roughly 200 people working. And then what's going to happen is that at 3 o'clock, 20 people will leave. By 4 o'clock, 40 people are going to leave. And eventually, when you hit 5 o'clock and as demand goes down, all 100 people that worked at 5 o'clock, the 9 to 5, will leave. But at the same time, at 12 o'clock, you're going to bring in an extra 25 people to meet the overnight demand, and they will work until 8 o'clock. And eventually, at 3 o'clock, until 11, an extra 20 people will come in. And finally, between 11 o'clock at night to 7, you're only going to have roughly about 15 people to meet the very, very slow demand that's happening. Now, I did this number and we came up to 270 people, but there's about a lot of things that you can actually look at this that might become a little bit problematic. Number one, seasonality. Okay, when you look at seasonality, there's a lot of things that could factor in this that we have to figure out what could go wrong. And another thing that could go wrong is that in the months leading to December, the demand for FedEx call centers spikes because a lot of people, both companies and individuals, will start tracking their packages. So as a result, when we go into December, even though we have 270 people working, 7 days a week for whatever amount, we may have to bring that number to 300. Now, how do I calculate all this together? Now, there's a lot of things you can calculate here, but the way we start to calculate this is that when you look at the quality control and we come that back to understanding a little bit more about tracking signals, what we start to figure out here is that our goal should be that on average, we have to look at the demand. We have to look at how many people walk in, and then we have to figure out that the average call should be about 5 to 10 minutes, and eventually somebody should wait less than 5 minutes, and a goal should be 3 minutes. So if somebody's waiting for over 5 to 10 minutes, it's unacceptable. And if this happens in peak season, in the middle of 2 or 3 o'clock, we have to fix it. Okay? We don't want people to wait 30, 40 minutes to get tracking on their package. So this means we may need to hire more people starting in, say, September or October, so that when we build the demand coming into December, the demand will be there and eventually that we can be able to utilize it. Now, before we hopefully give you a summary of what we talked about, I just want to show you these two important websites here. All right, so I'm just going to show you what simple moving averages is, and then EOQ, because EOQ is going to come back to us in inventory, in ERP, and in other conversations. So very quickly, guys, I'm going to turn your attention over to my website. Here's the first one, simple moving averages. And in simple moving averages, what you're going to do is you're going to take years. Let's cut it down from 12, maybe to 5 years, generate it. And what you can see here, based on these numbers, let's assume you have sales in year one, you sold 120. Year two, you sold 75. Year three, you sold 150. Year four, you sold 0. Maybe you took a leave of absence. And then you came back and you sold 100. So the question now is how do you find year six? And how does year six look like? So to do that, you click find, and it will generate you, okay, a report, and that report will show you based on these numbers and the calculation that they did, they came up with a certain output that you're probably going to sell roughly about 84 units. Okay, given the fact that you missed a year, given the fact that you had a stellar year prior, they're going to assume that in the third year, that's how much you're going to sell. And what you can do is you can play around with the numbers and it could help you out. Now, going out of this particular calculator, there's also the EOQ models. Now, EOQ models, I'll teach you it later on. It does become very important for us in inventory, safety stocks, and beyond. But let's say you have a demand in your product for 150 units. Your order cost to hold it, $5 per unit, and then to order it to hold it is 250. You calculate it, and based on 150 units, it tells you that the order inventory, the economic order quantity model, should be about 25. Now let's assume there's a couple of zeros, and now it's 1500. Now it's up to about 76, 78. And let's say you go back to 150, but ordering cost goes down sharply to $1, and holding cost goes to like 25 cents. What is the new number? Look at it now. 34. Okay. Let's even go even more, and let's assume it's a cent and next to nothing to hold it and order it, and the demand is 150. What will be the number? You guessed it. 38. Okay. So these ideas help us understand a little bit more. And another thing that's also very important is if the ordering cost is more than the holding cost, look what happens now. It becomes very, very stable. Okay. So play around with this for now. I'm going to show you later on in our class what you are looking and needing doing. But I left both particular websites out there for you guys so that you can play around with it and see it. Now, please remember, guys, I'm not always going to be focusing on the calculations. There's more to it than that, but please make sure that you can understand it, read it over, and eventually be able to do it. Okay? All right, I just want to summarize what we mentioned for today. Today, we talked a little bit about forecast, why forecast plays an important role for operation managers and their planning. And we realized that it's very important because you want to nail exactly how much you should buy, when should you buy it, where should you buy it, and at what time should you buy it. However, please remember that we're talking about the future. We cannot predict the future. I cannot predict what's going to happen next 2 years. Heck, I cannot predict what's going to happen next 20 minutes. So in order to help us understand the future, we look at two types of forecasting in the future. Qualitative, that looks at the quality, looks at people's opinions and jury of expertise. Salespeople, what they feel about the product, especially in unknown circumstances. And quantitative, we look at quantitative means and eventually understand a little bit more about what we could do and how we can do it. Then, of course, we have qualitative forecasting, which is the most used methodology that we have. And due to mathematical complexities of quantitative methodologies, a lot of times we combine both of them together. Okay, so a lot of times we can say that on average, 78% of the users like this product, and we can determine that this product meets a threshold because if it's over 50 people, it means half of the population likes it. Okay. But the idea behind the forecast is we look for patterns. We're not going to always nail it. Okay. Nobody knows exactly when they're going to strike rich, when they're going to buy the first house, or when they're going to go kaput kaput. But what our goal should be is to always figure out a number, a figure, a pattern, and to fix it. Okay, it's a game of rally, and as long as you figure out the rally, please make sure that you understand it very well, and please make sure you use the calculators. Okay, so I'm going to leave some work for you guys. Please review it. I'll give you information of what you need to do, but please make sure to finish it by next week. Also, guys, if you have LTA, please complete it by next week. Very, very important. It will become an important document for your next procedures, and please make sure that you'll be able to put it together. Okay, so thank you so much. Here's some celebration. Hope you enjoyed the async class. Please write down a review for me. Please let me know what you guys felt about it. And with that being said, that's all I have. Good luck and enjoy. Have yourself a good one, and I'll see you here next week. Bye for now.